there. Going to spend some time today talking about political competition in the United Kingdom. We'll focus mostly on the dynamics of political party competition and then spend a little bit of time on how the electoral system for the House of Commons affects that, and close out by thinking about the role of civil society. Political parties, four that I'm going to focus on, although there's a few others that we will touch on occasionally at the midway point of this lecture or so. The Conservatives, led by Boris Johnson, currently in government. The Labour Party, currently led by Sir Keir Starmer, the major opposition party. Then a couple of third parties that have been significant in the last decade or two. That's the Liberal Democrats, kind of a centrist national party, and then the Scottish National Party, which is what it says it is on the tin. There are 10 different parties as of this recording in the summer of 2021 that are represented in Parliament. Plus, I think at the moment, 6 independents, so people with no political party affiliation, mostly because they've been booted out of their parties, but they haven't lost their seats. And then one Irish Republican party called Sinn Féin that consistently wins a few seats in Parliament every general election, but refuses to take them in order to avoid recognizing the legitimacy of the British government in Ireland or swearing an oath of loyalty to the Queen. But I'll focus on these 4 because they tend to be the most politically significant in modern British politics. Starting with the Conservatives, this is the party that has been in government in its own right since 2015, and before that in coalition from 2010 to 2015. A common nickname for the Conservatives is the Tories. I don't know why that is. I'm sure you could look it up if you are interested, but I'm going to use those terms interchangeably, and you need to be able to recognize them both. Ideologically, the Conservatives are pretty analogous to the Republican Party in the United States, although I would argue a little bit closer to the center. They tend to be generally conservative. They tend to be more pro-free market. This was not always the dominant component of their ideology, and in particular, after World War II, the Conservatives were in with Labour on that collectivist consensus that I talked about in the history lecture for this unit. So they supported the establishment of the National Health Service. They supported the establishment of a robust state, and they kind of carved out this identity as a pragmatic conservative party that was interested in governing. The major shift in the conservative ideology happened under the pivotal prime ministership or premiership of Margaret Thatcher, which lasted throughout the 1980s. And she really shifted the Conservative Party much more aggressively in the direction of supporting neoliberal policies, supporting economic liberalization, deregulation, busting unions, shutting down workers' strikes, and so forth. So that was a significant rightward shift in terms of political attitudes for the Conservatives. They've come back a little bit towards the center since the end of Thatcher's leadership of the party, but they remain generally identified with that kind of more economically small L liberal ideology. In general, in the last 10 years, the Conservative Party has been pro-Brexit. Before the Brexit referendum in 2016, that was not necessarily the case. There was a significant divide within the Conservative Party, and many of its leaders, including former Prime Minister David Cameron, actively campaigned to keep the UK in the European Union. But since Brexit has happened, or since the referendum delivered its results, the subsequent leadership of the Conservative Party has been more and more committed to Brexit, and Boris Johnson, the current leader and Prime Minister, in many respects, gained leadership as a result of promising that he was going to deliver on a stronger or a harder Brexit. I'm going to pause momentarily. It would be, I think, unprofessional and not very academically sound of me to express opinions on the hairstyles or the personal appearance of any leader of a case study country, but I am just going to point out, without expressing any opinions about it, that this image represents Boris Johnson's official portrait. So he had all the time in the world to prepare for this, and he chose to make his hair look like this. Not expressing a judgment, just a statement of fact. Second big party, the UK we usually characterize as having a two-party system or a two-party dominant system, and the other big party in that two-party system since 1945 has been the Labour Party, has a U in it because they're English. Labour is founded in 1900 as really an outgrowth, a political outgrowth of the trade union movement, and after World War II, the other sort of left-of-center party, the Liberal Party, kind of fades away, and Labour becomes really the dominant leftist party in the United Kingdom, although again, it's fairly moderate, it's fairly centrist, probably a little bit to the left of the Democrats in the United States, but not certainly not a revolutionary or a aggressively socialist party. The influence of unions in the Labour Party has declined pretty steadily since the 1970s for a couple of different reasons. One is just sort of economic change, right? So the United Kingdom is a more service-oriented economy and a less industrial economy than it was 100 years ago. And so there's just fewer people in the UK who exist in that demographic that used to be the core base of labor, those blue-collar factory workers. Under Thatcher's government, the power of unions in British politics and in the British economy weakened significantly. And so that undermined that traditional base of support for labor. And then in the 70s and 80s, there were also these kind of internal divisions within the Labour Party between moderates and socialists. And so there was some infighting, and ultimately there were some defections from the Labour Party, which have kind of weakened the identity between labor and trade unions, although I think you would probably find that most trade union members in the UK continue to vote Labour, but it's certainly less clear than it used to be. Ideologically, Labour is a slightly left of centre party in the British context. They have continually been identified with really strong support for the welfare state, for taxing and spending on public services. Although it's really worth noting that similar to what happened with the Democrats under Bill Clinton in the 90s, under Prime Minister Tony Blair, who was in power from 1997 to 2007, this ideology known as New Labour somewhat uncreatively took hold, and the party sort of shifted towards somewhat more moderate policies. Blair also, it's worth noting, emphasized a variety of forms of constitutional reform. So he pushed the reform of the House of Lords, the decrease in the number of hereditary peerages. He pushed for the creation of a Supreme Court, taking that judicial appeals function out of the House of Lords, and he pushed significantly for devolution of government powers to Scotland, to Northern Ireland, and to a lesser degree to Wales. So he identified himself with those constitutional changes, but also towards a shift a little bit towards the center of British policies. Similar to the Conservatives, Labour was really internally divided over Brexit during the run-up to the referendum and the debate over how to implement Brexit. And in fact, it was pretty widely thought that Jeremy Corbyn, who is the most recently departed leader of the Labour Party, was for a long time skeptical of British membership in the European Union. He campaigned against Brexit, but he did so sort of half-heartedly, which might or might not be a reason why that referendum ultimately succeeded. But Corbyn was replaced a year or two ago by the current leader named Sir Keir Starmer. So Labour sits in opposition. You'll see Keir Starmer question Boris Johnson and Prime Minister's questions on a regular basis. This is the major opposition party, and so that's who names the shadow cabinet, if you're thinking back to that particular aspect of the British regime. Party number 3 worth mentioning is a national third party known as the Liberal Democrats. If you have the 2015 edition of your textbook, that's the green one, it indicates that the Liberal Democrats might have achieved such prominence as to make the UK sort of a 2.5 party system. That's not really true anymore. The Lib Dems suffered significant defeats in the 2015 general election. This party's founded in 1988 by a combination of two groups of people. One is the kind of remnants of the Liberal Party, which is this party that lost a good deal of its voters after World War II to the Labour Party, and also by some moderates from the Labour Party who defected and because they felt that their party was moving too far to the left. Ideologically, the Lib Dems are usually sort of situated somewhere between Labour and the Conservatives. They tend to be a more moderate party. They were more consistently opposed to Brexit in the run-up to the referendum than either of those two larger parties. They tend to stand for a sort of internationalist and somewhat technocratic view of the world. They tend to appeal to highly educated, younger urban voters, although that's obviously not 100% accurate description of their base. One other idea that the Lib Dems have consistently stood for is to support reforms to the electoral system. And if you think back to what we have talked about in this course about the effects of the single-member district plurality system, it should be pretty clear why a national third party that has really struggled to make its votes translate into seats would be against the single-member district plurality system. Their current leader is a guy named Ed Davey, but you might be more familiar with a name Nick Clegg. He was a leader of the Lib Dems who served as deputy prime minister when Liberal Democrats, in kind of their high water mark and influence in national politics, served as the junior partner in the conservative Lib Dem coalition, which was in government from 2010 to 2015. During that time, one of the Lib Dems' conditions for joining that coalition was that they demanded a nationwide referendum on what was known as the alternative vote. I talked about this a little bit in your lecture on the British political regime. They wanted a different electoral system, which would have the effect of increasing the chances that Lib Dems and other members of national third parties would get elected to seats in parliament. That referendum failed pretty decisively. In addition, the Lib Dems, when they joined the coalition government, were entering into a situation where they had to start implementing all these austerity policies because the financial crisis of 2008 had really cut back on British government revenue. They had made a number of pledges to protect funding for the NHS, to ensure that student tuition, the student share of tuition in British universities, wouldn't rise. They ultimately had to go back on at least the tuition promise. And as a consequence, they lost a lot of votes. A lot of people defected from the Lib Dems in the 2015 general election because there was this widespread perception that they had compromised too much in order to gain power, in order to go into this coalition government. So the Liberal Democrats are no longer as much of a force. They lost a significant number of seats in Parliament. The 2010 election was probably their best showing, but we'll see what happens to them in the future. They are the best example of a nationwide third party in the UK. Finally, thinking about third parties, but this time a more regional one, let's go a bit north and look at the Scottish National Party. This is the largest party in Scotland. It is in government in Scotland, and despite the fact that the Scottish electoral system is explicitly designed to avoid any party having majority in the Scottish Parliament, the SNP right now has just under half. They have 64 of the 129 seats in the Scottish Parliament, and they did, I think, in 2007 win an outright majority, kind of against all odds. So the SNP is dominant in the Scottish legislature. They're also dominant in Scottish seats in the House of Commons. They have 45 of the 59 constituencies currently allocated to Scotland. Ideologically, the SNP does what it says on the label, which is it's a Scottish nationalist party. They call for Scottish independence and generally for a stronger sense of Scottish identity. They have pushed before, they've supported a referendum, which was ultimately unsuccessful, calling for Scottish independence. In the wake of Brexit, they have called for another one, although it's unclear whether it's going to happen. On other issues, the Scottish National Party also tends to be left of center. They generally support sort of a social democratic ideology. Scottish voters, when they don't vote for the SNP, often tend to vote for the Labour Party's sister organization in Scotland. And so the SNP's ideological priorities have kind of lined up with what their voters call for. The SNP has also been really strongly opposed to Brexit. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but Scotland was the region of the UK that voted most strongly against Brexit in the 2016 referendum. And again, support for staying in the European Union and discontent in Scotland with the result of that referendum has led to increased support in at least some parts of the SNP among some Scottish nationalists for like a renewed push for independence. The current leader and also First Minister of Scotland is named Nicola Sturgeon. It is a fun fact that is fun to nobody but me, but I get to tell you anyway, that the previous leader of the SNP was a guy named Alex Salmond, thus making this party uncommonly dedicated to fish-type names for its leaders. I hope that you remember that forever. And it's just worth noting that this Nicola Sturgeon is not actually a member of Parliament. She doesn't sit in Westminster. She sits in the Scottish Parliament, and she is the First Minister of Scotland, which is to say the chief executive there. Finally, just a couple of words about other parties worth noting, because as I said, there's more than these four parties represented in Parliament on a regular basis. There's a few other regional parties in Wales, in Northern Ireland, in Scotland that consistently win seats, and we can talk a little bit later about why that might be as a result of the British electoral system, which privileges having concentrated local support. In Wales, there is a nationalist party called Plaid Cymru. I know it's not pronounced like you think it's pronounced. Welsh is confusing. And that's the Nationalist Party for Wales. Always has a couple of seats from Wales in Parliament. In Ireland, in Northern Ireland, there are two parties that consistently get most, but not all of the seats. Northern Ireland has a particularly complicated and fragmented political landscape. The major unionist party is called the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP. They're unionists unionist, meaning that they support the continued union between Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom. They want Northern Ireland to remain part of the UK, as opposed to the other major position in Northern Irish politics is the Republicans, which is to say, those people who are predominantly represented by a party called Sinn Féin tend to believe that Northern Ireland should become independent of the United Kingdom and should be united with the Republic of Ireland. Unionists are more predominantly Protestant in Northern Ireland. Republicans are more predominantly Catholic. There's not necessarily a one-to-one correspondence between your religious upbringing and your political identity, but that tends to be how it shakes out. The DUP is worth noting because in 2017, they found themselves in this odd position. They only had a handful, I don't know, 6 or 7 seats in Parliament at Westminster. But they actually ended up being the power brokers because Theresa May, who was then the leader of the Conservative Party, managed to lose her Conservative majority in the 2017 general election, which was her idea. And she actually had to turn to the DUP in order to try and get enough votes to make herself prime minister to keep her government in power. And that's all well and good, but that put the DUP in this position of being able to extract really significant concessions from the Conservative government, including a pretty significant financial aid package for Northern Ireland, and also including some really detailed promises about the way that Northern Ireland would be treated in the Brexit negotiations, which ultimately made it really, really difficult for Theresa May to hold on to power. Sinn Féin, by contrast, routinely wins about half a dozen seats in elections to Parliament in Northern Irish constituencies, but they never take these seats. They, again, refuse to take up their seats in Parliament because it would involve acknowledging the legitimacy of British rule in Northern Ireland, which is contradictory to Sinn Féin's entire political identity. One other national party no longer represented in Parliament, they haven't had any members of Parliament since 2017, but worth mentioning anyway, is an institution called the UKIP, the UK Independence Party. This party started out as essentially a single-issue party calling for Brexit and demanding particularly that immigration to the United Kingdom from the EU and beyond be reduced. UKIP was notable for a couple of reasons. Number one, they're an interesting illustration of the power of proportional representation, because when UKIP politicians first started getting elected in the United Kingdom, it wasn't to the House of Commons. It was actually to, ironically, the European Parliament. In other words, they kept getting seats in this elected institution, which they felt shouldn't exist in the United Kingdom. And the reason they got that is because members of the European Parliament, unlike members of the British Parliament, are elected through proportional representation. And so relatively small fringe parties can still get seats. And so UKIP actually first kind of made its name through getting people elected to the European Parliament. They ultimately, their high water mark, I think, was 2 members of Parliament in Westminster. They have kind of fallen apart and made a significant turn to the hard right, like even more sort of xenophobic and often Islamophobic rhetoric than had previously been characteristic of UKIP since the Brexit referendum. And they've really lost a significant amount of power, but it's just worth pointing out that UKIP was both a driving force in and really good evidence of the rising tide of and the rising significance of pro-Brexit, anti-EU, and anti-immigration sentiment in British politics. It's really hard to explain a country's party system without making reference to its electoral system, so we should do this now. As I said in your lecture on regime, the system for electing members of the House of Commons is single-member district plurality. There are 650 constituencies in the United Kingdom. Each one votes in a general election, and whoever gets the most votes in a constituency wins the seat. You know how this works. Under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act of 2011, there has to be a general election at least every 5 years. I talked in your regime lecture about some other circumstances in which you could have an earlier election, and that has in fact happened in 2017 and 2019. But there are general elections at minimum every 5 years. Parties in the UK, despite what we usually know about SMDP, tend to be fairly well disciplined. Part of that has to do with the fact that in a parliamentary system, the reason you try and get yourself into the legislature in the first place is in order to support government by your party. And so defecting from your party tends to threaten the ability of your party to wield power. That's problematic. Part of it is that the constituencies are geographically fairly small. And a fun fact is that members of parliament actually aren't required to live in their constituency. They technically aren't required to live in the United Kingdom at all. Most members of parliament do live in their district they represent, or very near, or in the next district over. But the consequence of that is that there's just not that much emphasis on serving local interests, particularly compared to if you pay attention to United States politics. There's much less of that kind of bringing home government spending to your local constituency in British politics. People tend to be more tightly aligned with their parties and a little bit less tightly aligned with local interests, although Brexit has, of course, thrown a lot of that into question. One final note. When you start thinking about the devolved legislatures in Wales and Northern Ireland and in Scotland, there are different electoral systems. The electoral systems for all three of those legislatures have actually been explicitly designed to make it more difficult for any one party to gain an outright majority in those regional parliaments. And so it's just worth noting that's going to have different implications for both the political party systems in the regional legislatures and also the ability of a single party to form a government in those regional parliaments. Um, what we can see if we look at some data about just the number of seats returned for each party in general elections going all the way back to 1922 is that almost all of the time, single member district plurality in this context has returned an outright majority for at least for one party. So since World War II, there's only been 3 instances in which a general election has resulted in something called a hung parliament, which is to say no party has a majority. There's been a couple of other hung parliaments because one party had a really narrow majority and then a couple of its members defected from the party. But the general rule of thumb is that single member district plurality is often going to lead to one party winning an outright majority. And you can see here that majority will fluctuate over time. It'll go back and forth between Labour and the Conservatives. But in the post-World War II era, the rule it's much more common to have a majority than not. The other thing that I hope will remember, or if not, I'll refresh your memory about with respect to single member district plurality elections, is that there tends to be a serious distortion between the percentage of votes that people allocate to a given party and the percentage of seats in the legislature that members of that party get. And so what you can see, this is an image from, I think, the library of the House of Commons itself, which compares for the most recent 3 general elections in the UK. On the bottom, the share of popular votes that each party got, and then on the top, the share of seats that each party got in the House of Commons. So if you take a look at this graph, what you'll see is that in general, the Conservatives and the Scottish National Party, and to a lesser extent the Labour Party, tend to benefit from the SMDP system. A lot of them will win elections in constituencies with a plurality but not a majority of the votes. And so they can be somewhat overrepresented with respect to that. On the other hand, if you look at that kind of orangish bar in each of these graphs, you'll see that the Liberal Democrats are the party that is really disadvantaged by the single member district plurality electoral system. They get a fair chunk of votes in a number of constituencies, but it's very few constituencies do they get enough votes to actually take the seat, to beat out the Labour or the Conservative candidate. So just worth noting, this is one of the most persistent criticisms of the British electoral system in particular. The Lib Dems have been obviously very strident in advancing critiques of this system. Although the most recent attempt at reform, the alternative vote referendum, failed pretty decisively. And it doesn't appear to my untrained eye to be super likely that that's going to change in the near future, but keep an eye on it, and definitely worth thinking about in terms of the impact of electoral systems on party systems. Okay, last thing to think about moving beyond moving beyond the electoral cycle, thinking about civil society more broadly. In order to understand what I need to tell you about civil society in the UK, it's worth reminding you about just 2 fancy terms that we've used in this course for types of interest group systems, so ways that political systems manage the competition between different groups of people or organized citizens who are trying to advocate for a particular platform. One system that we sometimes see is known as the pluralist system. That's what characterizes American politics, for instance. In that system, there are a bunch of different interest groups. They're all more or less autonomous from or independent of the state. They have their own funding, they have their own direction, they make their own decisions, and they compete with each other for influence by lobbying legislators or by trying to recruit public support for their causes or whatever it is that they might do. The alternative to that system is what's known as the corporatist system, in which there is a limited number of groups. So you might have a designated group to represent farmers, you might have a designated group to represent attorneys, you might have a designated group to represent teachers. Sometimes we call these single peak associations. And that limited number of groups get some sort of preferential access to policymaking because either the state and or the dominant political party recognizes them. The UK, I think we tend to characterize more as pluralist, but one significant sort of corporatist aspect of the British interest group system is in the form of what are delightfully known as quangos. Those are quasi autonomous non governmental organizations. It is quite possibly the best acronym in the AP CompGov course. Quangos are government appointed organizations. That serve a variety of functions. Sometimes they advise the government on policy. Sometimes they actually make decisions about regulations. A couple of them have really limited powers to act as tribunals in various legal disputes in really specific areas. The Quangos are funded by taxpayers, but they are not directly controlled by the government. Boris Johnson can't just go around to the Forestry Commission, which is a well-established Quango in the UK that maintains and expands public forests in the United Kingdom. Boris Johnson can't just go to them and directly tell them what to do. The Quangos are often controversial. Sometimes they have, Margaret, going as far back as Margaret Thatcher, she criticized them as wasteful and unaccountable and undemocratic. Going back to 2010, when the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats were in coalition and making all these noises about austerity and the need to cut government spending, they promised what was delightfully called a bonfire of the Quangos, and they actually eliminated a bunch of these organizations and they merged a bunch of others in the name of saving government money. But there's, depending how you count, somewhere between 600 and 1,200 Quangos remaining in the UK. So I think it's pretty clear, not going anywhere. Last thing to note is that the United Kingdom has a very free and active media sector. This is, according to most of the international rankings, the UK has by far the freest press of any of our case study countries in this course. They do have, it's worth noting, a national taxpayer-supported broadcasting corporation. That's the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, which produces a huge amount of television, radio, and internet news and broadcasts in the UK and also around the world. It's funded by a national, what's called a TV license fee, which you're supposed to pay if you watch or stream television anywhere in the United Kingdom. But there's pretty strong protections for the BBC's editorial independence. So it's not accurate, even though it's a taxpayer-supported media organization, it's not accurate to say that it is state media in the same way that you would in, say, Russia or China, where the state is really directly influencing the kinds of media that's being produced by the dominant television channels. That's all the information I want to impart. I'm just going to leave you with one question to consider, which is that I think if you had taken this course, 15 years ago, I would have been very comfortable in just kind of blithely telling you the UK has a really stable two-party system that's dominated by Labour and the Conservatives, and there's some little blips on the radar in Scotland and maybe in these more yuppie districts in London that vote for the Lib Dems, but it's basically just always going to be the Tories or Labour forever and ever. Amen. But in the last 10, 15 years, we've seen some pretty significant disruptions to the political party system. And so I'll ask you to spend a little time before I see you next thinking about what might lead to disruptions in what used to be this fairly stable two-party system. And we will, I hope, have some time to talk about that in class soon. Thanks.